All right. Well, in the interest of time, we will get started, but it is being recorded, so this will be able to be disseminated to everyone through our Chamber and EDC channels and elsewhere. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brittany Orcutt. I'm the Economic Development Specialist here at the Morris County Chamber and Morris County Economic Development Corporation. This has been a really exciting initiative. The Agriculture and Resiliency Committee is a partnership between our farmers, our businesses, and the county. And the goal is to inventory and assess what we have as our resources as far as a county in the event of a natural disaster or another pandemic. And we also want to get grassroots support among our residents so that they are thinking about what they can be doing on a residential community level to prepare themselves best. And so we have created a series of lessons via PDFs that are on our website, and now we're bringing them into live webinar format. And so we are very excited to have our first one kick off today. And our presenters, we've got Pete Nitzsche, who is the Agriculture Agent for Morris County, and Jen Taylor, Family and Community Health Sciences for Passaic County. They are a wealth of knowledge, and I'm very excited to pass it over to them to teach us about gardening and food preservation and all of that wonderful stuff. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you, Brittany. Is my screen sharing? You can see my slide? Okay. I'm here this afternoon to talk to you a little bit about backyard gardening, and particularly backyard vegetable gardening. If you're tuning into this webinar, you're obviously interested in gardening in your backyard and growing your own food. But why are some of the reasons you might want to be interested in growing a vegetable garden in your home is it's a great outdoor family activity, exercise in maintaining your garden. One of the big things is producing fresh, nutritious, tasty food right there locally in your yard. It allows you to select different varieties that you may not get from the supermarket or also from farm markets. Convenience, it's right there close. Economics, sometimes vegetable gardening can be not so economic if you spend a lot of time or energy doing it. But what we're really talking today, though, is food resiliency. So in the event of a disaster or a pandemic and things, you have some food locally at your home available to your family. Just like in real estate, three of the most important things about siting a vegetable garden is location, location, location. And that some of those considerations for location in a vegetable garden in your home is sunlight. So most vegetables, particularly flowering and fruiting vegetables, want a lot of sunlight, ideally full sunlight throughout the day, but at least 8 hours for those type of crops. If you're lacking, have trees and shade in some manner, you may have to resort to growing certain root vegetables. And if you're really lacking in sun, you're not going to be able to grow a whole lot of vegetables, but things like lettuce and spinach, you can get away with 4 hours of direct sunlight. Beyond light itself, when situating your vegetable garden, you want to stay away from trees and shrubs. Trees and shrubs compete with your vegetable crops for water and nutrients. And so if you look up and see leaves above you, there's probably roots below you that are going to compete with your vegetables. So you want to move your garden a little bit farther away from that area. Also, particularly when it comes to trees, we want to avoid a vegetable garden anywhere near black walnut trees. Black walnut roots give off a substance called jugulone that harms other plants, and particularly tomatoes are very sensitive to this compound. So keep your vegetable garden away from black walnut trees if possible. When we were talking about that shade, you can get some dappled light coming through shade trees, but recognize also stay away from structures. The shade from a house is much more dense or a structure than it would be coming through trees or shrubs. Orientation, ideally we would run the rows of a vegetable garden north to south so the sun moves over the plot and gives you sunlight from east as it moves from east to west over the garden. But there really isn't a huge difference there. Don't fixate on the orientation, but if you can, run the rows north-south. more important maybe, it definitely is soil. This is in the spring is a good time of year to look around your yard when it's raining a lot and see that you have decent drainage. Most people are growing things like tomatoes in their garden, or not growing rice. So we want to avoid areas that are going to puddle and not drain well during the growing season and harm the crop. We get root rots and things with wet soils. Topsoil, we'll talk about ways to improve what you've got. Digging down a little bit will tell you how much topsoil you have and a little bit about the quality. But again, there's ways to amend that soil that you have on site and make it better if you're lacking in topsoil on your site. But if you can choose a different area on your yard that has better topsoil depth and quality, certainly do so then when you're siting your vegetable garden. Contamination, a lot of folks ask us about contamination. Probably the most common concern I have is with lead. So if you have a home that's older, that may have been painted with lead before 1978, that's one of the, we'll talk about soil testing in a minute, but that's one of the tests I would run. Otherwise, hopefully you don't have any other concerns with contamination on your site. Some other site considerations when placing your garden is proximity to the kitchen. That's much more convenient. If it's close to the kitchen, you can go out and grab a lettuce leaf or something and put it in a salad. But that can be balanced sometimes with appearance and views. If you're more of a get it done production vegetable garden, it sometimes doesn't look so great outside the kitchen window. So you have to balance that with you and your significant other. Access to tools is important, so you don't want to walk too far to get your tools out of the garage or shed. So having that garden convenient located to that, and access to water to irrigate. If it gets dry, you're going to want to have ready access to water so that you can irrigate your vegetable garden. And the big consideration around Morris County and other areas are wildlife like deer. They'll eat just about every vegetable that you can grow, maybe the exceptions is onions and garlic. And so usually you have to consider that and provide some protection, a deer fence or barrier, in order to keep the deer out of your vegetable garden. If you don't have room to plant a large vegetable garden, you can also vegetable gardening containers. We want to think about the size of the container. Bigger is usually better. We're usually using growing media or mixes that don't actually contain soil. They might have compost, but usually there's peat, perlite, vermiculite, some other materials that are put in mixes that are more ideal for growing in a pot. If you work during the day, you might consider self-watering containers. Vegetables in containers are very dependent on you for water and nutrients, less of a buffering capacity of the soil. Also consider support and variety selection. You might want to choose more compact varieties. Throughout my presentation and at the end, we'll talk about fact sheets, materials that are available on our extension website. We do have one on container gardening with vegetables that you might avail yourself to get more details on that. When considering planting your vegetable garden, you want to consider size. Try and be realistic in the spring. It gets very hot in August to maintain a garden. It's better to start out small. You can always expand later as you gain experience in vegetable garden if you're a novice at it. And try and resist the lure of the seed catalogs in the winter, or the garden centers in the early spring. Makes you want to plant lots of things, maybe more than your family can use, which you can always donate to the needy for that, but you might want to think about what your family will actually eat. If your kids don't eat kohlrabi, you don't need 100 feet worth of kohlrabi. So think about what your family needs and eats, and help that, or use that to help determine the size and capacity of your vegetable garden. And we really recommend you draw out a plan as you decide and work through your vegetable garden, drawing it to scale so that you have the size, particularly noting pathways or spacing and walkways. If you have a wheelbarrow or a garden cart, you want to make sure that it can get down the rows and that you're not tight roping down very narrow rows between beds in your vegetable garden. Also on your plan, you want to note early and late plantings. We'll talk about succession planting in a minute, but a lot of folks only do a late spring planting when they could be taking more advantage of the space, planting things earlier and planting things later in their garden. And then also on that plan, noting the direction of north, which becomes important when you're arranging certain crops. So one of the things, we have a few vegetable crops that are perennial. Most are annual, or start from seed every year or transplant and then finish up. But crops like in this picture here, like asparagus, are perennial, and they do tend to get very tall. So those are asparagus ferns after it leaves out, and that gets 6, 7, maybe even 8 feet tall. And so both for maintaining those crowns in the soil, you want to put those perennial crops to one side and note where north is so they're not shading a lot of the other crops. And then you want to make the map and think about the arrangement for crop rotation. So crop rotation is something we encourage all gardeners and farmers to do, to move crops around in their vegetable garden or fields in order to avoid the buildup of pests, insects, and diseases. And with that, most vegetable crops in the same family, for instance, tomatoes and eggplant and peppers are in the same family. And so we want to move them to a different place every year in the vegetable garden so that if there's an insect egg or overwintering eggs in the soil, it's moved away from the spot it was grown the year before as far as possible so that the pest does not splash up or hatch out of the ground and get right there and not have much to move in order to feed on the crop. In the case of insects, hopefully a bird or a toad or something eats them on the way when they go to try and find your other crop. So as best as possible, it's difficult sometimes in a small vegetable garden, but as best as possible, we move things around, practice crop rotation. And again, that's another reason for the map so that we can remember where the tomatoes were grown the year before. We don't always have a ton of space in the home vegetable garden, so we want to maximize that. And you can do that in some cases with things like tomatoes by going vertical, things like cucumbers as well. We can grow them up, stake them up, get them off the ground so that they take up less space in the garden and we can plant more plants per unit area. We can also take advantage of more bush type plants. So we giving the example of cucumbers, you can grow them up a vine, but there's also longer vine types and bush types. So that if you have a small garden, you might choose some of the more bush type varieties to take up less space and get more types of vegetables in your garden. We mentioned on that plan early and late crops and planning that out, what we call succession planting. So to maximize use of the space, we want to plant both early and late. For instance, if you grow peas very early, starting in March or April, planted, they can be out of there in June, and then you might be able to come back with a zucchini crop later in the season. So you're getting 2 crops out of one space as opposed to just one. So plan for that, maximizes your production per unit area in the vegetable garden. Also, utilizing transplants takes longer from seed to grow a plant. And so for certain things, such as zucchini or cucumbers, you can direct seed those. You can also use transplants. So if you're starting them indoors or buying transplants, they can go in and maximize the use of that space because they're taking up less time in the garden. One of the good things about vegetable gardening is that you can, again, choose different varieties that may not be available in the store. Some of the things grown for the stores are varieties that are selected more for shipability. And so we can use softer varieties that have more unique shapes, sizes, and colors. Again, we mentioned the different growth habits that we can take advantage of. So you can grow yellow tomatoes, white tomatoes, those type of things that you might not be able to buy in the stores. And then there are varieties, if you look on labels and seed catalogs and seed packets, that resist disease. So there's some diseases that get on vegetables, and if you can choose a variety that's been bred or hybridized to resist disease, you don't have to worry about that particular problem. Some examples, common examples, are the wilt diseases in tomatoes and powdery mildew in cucumbers. Choosing those varieties means you don't have to worry about those diseases during the growing season. Some other tips is just to keep a notebook or diary of your vegetable garden, noting your planting dates and harvests and things so that you can improve year to year of your vegetable gardening techniques as you go through and record your successes and failures. This time of the year, certain varieties and vegetables need a longer growing season than would be easily available in the garden. And to get early harvest, we're often starting seeds indoors. One of the things we need to do is count back how many weeks from the last frost date if we're starting something like tomatoes. With northern New Jersey and Morris County, I'm looking at about May 20th as our reliable date to put plants out. We do have a fact sheet noting all the seedling dates, our starting seeds indoors fact sheet on our website. We're starting with clean potting mix again. Soil does not do well in containers, in pots indoors, and can harbor disease and insect pests. So usually we're starting with clean potting mix that's either been sterilized or pasteurized. And then when we're starting seedlings, the one thing I see gardeners do a lot is not use enough light, so they get spindly tomatoes. We want to put those lights very close to the seedlings, as close as possible without touching. Lights are not as strong as sunlight, but we can also use a southern facing window and such to get the max amount of light to get vegetable seedlings started in the spring. Some people ask why I'm going back to May 20th when the average frost date is maybe around May 5th. If you look at that chart, you have about a 50% chance of losing your plants to frost on May 5th. So that's why we push it back. Some years are better than others, but we often get a late frost up until May 20th. So you can get more frost dates on that website link indicated there. So with that, if we're talking about seeding tomatoes, we're counting back 6 to 8 weeks before that date. And so we're talking about seeding tomatoes indoors at the beginning of April to the mid-April to get them started so that you have a 6 to 8 week old transplant to put outdoors after the risk of frost is over. In prepping your garden area, it's good to know what the pH is, and that's in order to determine that a good soil test is important. So that'll tell us the pH of the soil, whether it's acid or lime or neutral or alkaline. In a vegetable garden, we're looking 6 to 6.5, and a soil test will tell you how much lime, either calcitic, calcium, or dolomitic, which contains magnesium, to bring that pH into the right range. So not knowing that, it's always good to start off with a soil test, and we'll give you links to our soil testing lab at the end of the presentation. You can avail yourself to a soil test. That test will also tell us how much nutrients are in the soil, the level of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and then which is what's typically in fertilizers. We can use both granular and liquid fertilizers, both if you're an organic gardener, you can use organic forms, or also you can use synthetic forms. Typically, granular forms and organic forms are slower release. They release the nutrients slower to the plant, and liquid and synthetic are more fast release. We don't recommend specific brands. Usually we're putting down the granular or the organic type of material in the spring. And I recommend a lot of times with gardeners to give the transplants early on in the season when the soil is cool and not releasing nutrients very fast, to use a liquid form just to get a boost and get it going. And then as the plant grows, it can access those granular materials in the soil as they slowly release during the growing season. We mentioned earlier access to water. Most vegetables need an inch of water, whether it's through rainfall or irrigation. So if we don't get an inch of water, we're going to want to do some type of irrigation. If we're going to use a sprinkler, we want to do that in the morning so that we don't have as much evaporation from the air and the dry air, and it also dries the plants out before the evening. Watering in the evening makes the plants wet overnight, and that can lead to fungal diseases. So typically, if we're going to use a sprinkler, we want to do it in the morning. We also encourage folks to consider soaker hoses or drip tubes, which are more efficient watering systems. The picture at the top is one example of a straw bale gardening. We did it for a demonstration a few years ago. That's one technique that's been popular with some gardeners. It's one of the things about it is those bales dry out quicker than the surrounding soil. So you definitely want soaker hoses or some means to irrigate those bales. One of the eager things that happens with gardeners that are eager to get going in the spring is they want to work the soil early, and we caution them not to work wet soil. The old farmer test to tell if the soil is too wet to work is you grab a handful of soil, squeeze it in a ball, and if you poke the ball and it stays together, it's too wet. If it crumbles, it should be dry enough to work. And so be careful about working it too wet in the spring. We got to wait till it dries out a little bit. If you work wet soil, it becomes compacted and we destroy soil structure, and your garden will look more like a construction site when it dries out and cracks and hardens. So resist the temptation and make sure that the soil has dried out a bit. Raised beds to help with drainage and to help the soil dry out are good. There's a lot of advantages to growing in raised beds. We're amending a smaller area. We're providing better drainage. It warms up earlier crops. You have more defined paths and less work when they compete. The downside is the cost of installing those beds and the drying out quicker. But overall, myself and others find raised beds to be a very good way to work. Once it's established, it makes vegetable gardening easier in the long term. We mentioned earlier, hopefully you have good topsoil on your site. If not, you want to amend the soil, and organic matter amendments really help to improve the soil. We can use manure, which adds nutrients to the soil. We want to use manure from herbivores, horses, sheep, those types of manures. We want to stay away from manure from cats or dogs, which can have pathogens. Also, with any of the manure, we want to use well-rotted manure in the spring. If you have fresh manure, you want to allow that to compost or break down. We want to stay away from that as it can burn crops if it's too fresh with nitrogen. And then also think food safety. We don't want things like E. coli around food crops. Leaves we can use. Composted is great. If we're going to put them on in the fall, we don't want to put them on too thick. And they do compete with the crop a little bit for nitrogen. So you might need to add a little fertilizer if you add a lot of leaves to the soil. Composted leaves and compost in general, a lot of people consider it brown gold. Adds organic matter, adds some nutrients, helps the soil structure, and then also adds beneficial organisms and microorganisms to the soil. So that's great for a vegetable garden. We encourage folks to add compost to a vegetable garden area. Some folks like to add peat moss. We're moving a little bit away from peat moss, one, because it costs money, and two, for some of the environmental concerns of harvesting the peat bogs too quickly, and that's a carbon sink. So better off availing yourself to compost. The county distributes municipal leaf compost, so those are better sources than compost these days. I mean, excuse me, peat moss. Planting seeds outdoors. Again, we have a table in one of our fact sheets on planting dates. We want to prepare the seed bed well, till it up, break it up, get a fine seed bed going. once we seed our crop, we want to keep them well watered. One of the tricks I use sometimes, if I have slow germinating seeds of beets and carrots, I'll throw some radishes in the row that come up real quick so that we know where the row is and versus weeds coming up in the garden soil. And then we want to make sure we plant them a little bit heavy, but then come back not too heavy and thin to the proper spacing. Can also start with transplants purchased from a garden center or farm stand. One of the things about plants, if we're coming from indoors on our own in our house, those plants have not been exposed to sunlight and the harsh conditions outdoors. So we typically have to harden them. We want to slowly expose them to outdoor conditions in a semi-protected location, limiting a little bit water and fertilizer. But with things like tomatoes, we don't want to go too cold a temperature that can affect the blossoms of the flower buds and cause misshapen fruit with tomatoes. So just want to slowly over time expose them to the outdoor conditions so they don't burn and die when you first put them out. Mulches are a great thing in the vegetable garden. We encourage folks to utilize those to help control weeds. Weeds are a big issue in the vegetable garden, but mulches help manage soil moisture, keep it more moist, keep the weeds down, and then can also influence soil temperature. So they can either speed up or slow down growth. Typically organic mulches like clean straw or grass clippings cool the soil, whereas some farmers and gardeners use black plastic or landscape fabric, which absorbs heat and warms the soil for crops that like it warm, like tomatoes, peppers, and cucurbits. With clean straw, we want to look for straw that has no weed seeds in it and not a lot of mature grain, so that we don't have a rye or oats crop in our garden. We want to grow the tomatoes. And with leaf clippings, we don't want to, or lawn clippings, grass clippings, if we utilize those, best to let them dry out on the lawn. We don't want them too thick. The nitrogen in them can start to break down and make them smell. And we also want to be careful of avoiding a lawn that's recently been treated with an herbicide. So tomatoes are very susceptible to a lawn herbicide called 2,4-D, very common. So if we're going to use lawn herbicides, we want untreated, lawn grass clippings, untreated, or wait 2 or 3 mowings before you collect those clippings and use them for a mulch. And we can help you at the extension office identify what kind of weeds you have, whether they're annual or perennial. And definitely, you'll get annuals every year, but we want to avoid planting a vegetable garden where there's a lot of perennial weeds, such as thistle here in a strawberry patch. We want to get those under control before we plant the garden. But we can help with weed ID and control. Again, we mentioned for control, mulching is a really good way to keep the weeds down. Most gardeners are familiar with hand weeding, and then shallow cultivation. All kinds of tools, and gardeners have their favorite, but the idea there is just cutting small weeds underneath the surface, cutting the root system out, letting them dry on the surface, and not turning over lots of more soil so that we get a new growth of weeds. So just shallowly cultivating those areas and getting the weeds under control in the vegetable garden. Also can think about season extension. So we were mentioning earlier frost. So we can get late frosts in the spring and early frosts in the fall. And a lot of gardeners avail themselves to materials called floating row covers, which is a cloth-like material that allows air, water, and light through, but provides a little bit of warmth. And so it provides a degree or two of warmth. So if a frost is threatening in the spring, we can put these materials over the crop and hopefully protect it from a frost. Same applies in the fall. Floating row covers can be used to float on certain crops like lettuce or carrots and things. They just float over the bed. For crops like tomatoes and peppers, usually we want to put a support over the plant to keep that row cover from abrading the growing tip of the plant. as it's growing through the season. And that's just a brief overview of planning and starting a vegetable garden and some of the techniques. We do have a lot of information on our website. On the left-hand side there, we do have lots of fact sheets and bulletins all about vegetable gardening, all about the pests that you might encounter. If you go on our website, you'll find our soil testing lab in order to test the soil, again, to get your pH and nutrient amounts that are in your site locally, and then the recommendations for what to apply. We have a calendar of events that you can avail yourself to, of webinars and events and meetings and things run by Extension, a gardening FAQ, and a weed gallery to show you some pictures of all those things that are going to grow in your vegetable garden and compete with your crops. Also, in most, if not all the counties, we have a Master Gardener helpline staffed by Master Gardener volunteers, listing Morris County's phone number there and the hours for our helpline, so those folks can hopefully address your questions that you might have about gardening. And there's also the email there. So if you have a pest or problem, you can grab a picture and email them a picture of your pest or problem, and they'll get back to you within a few days to address the problem there. And that's what I have about vegetable gardening, and hopefully that leads to some success and harvesting a lot of crops. And then I'm going to turn it over to Jen, who's going to talk to you about preserving some of those crops from the vegetable garden.
Thanks, Pete. You do have one question. I don't know if you just want to mention. It's for raised beds. Should pressure treated wood be avoided?
Thanks. That's a challenging question these days. The older form of pressure treated lumber you certainly didn't want to use because it was made from lead arsenic. The newer forms are copper material, which we need copper in small amounts. Plants need copper in small amounts, but in higher amounts, it does inhibit rot and protect and would harm a plant. There's not a lot of good information I've seen yet on the safety of that in the vegetable garden. So if you're concerned at all, I would stay away from it. Use more rot resistant lumber instead. It's more than likely safer than the old type, but I can't really say yes or no at this point in time.
All right, I'm going to ask you, there we go. Let's see if I can share. And I'm realizing I should have talked to you before I started my home garden, because I started very large and my rows are going east to west. But we'll see. Hopefully it keeps growing. All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Jen Salt Taylor, and I'm here to talk about after you harvest all this food, maybe what are you going to do with it, right? So the hope is that we can do some home food preservation. Just a quick note that Rutgers Cooperative Extension is an affirmative action, equal opportunity employer. Our programs and materials are open to all, so just a heads up. And then if there's any concerns you have or complaints, this is how you can file those. Just a little more information for you. Just a quick little diagram about the Rutgers Cooperative Extension structure in case you don't know who we are. We are a collaboration between the County Board of Commissioners, Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, and the United States Department of Agriculture. So then we work in your county, and we have 3 different departments within that county. So like Pete said, he's with Agricultural and Natural Resources. I'm with Family and Community Health Sciences. All right, so for today, this is going to be an introductory session. The hope is that I can motivate you to learn a little bit more about home food preservation and share a couple tips with you. But I really want to also emphasize the focus on food safety and using trusted resources when you're looking at home food preservation. All right, so we are going to go through some benefits of the home food preservation, food safety basics, the different methods we can use, and where we can learn more. All right, so cost savings is generally a good one for home food preservation. So we can also reduce food waste by preserving excess produce that you harvest from your gardens, or let's say you buy in bulk from your local farmer or produce stand. And then you can also buy in bulk. It'll be cheaper than buying fruit and vegetables out of season. Also, when you are buying local, that kind of reduces the added cost of transportation and packaging for those food items. Next, we want to use quality products, right? So you can use quality ingredients and proper techniques to create better flavor than commercially made products, right? You can also make flavors that are unique to that your family enjoys. We are talking about sustainability and control here. So we want to reduce transportation and packaging waste of commercially produced foods. You can control what goes into each of your products. And again, purchasing local ingredients in season can help support your local economy. I know we talked a little bit about the kind of global supply system. So looking kind of more locally, what can we do in our own neighborhoods? And then practicality, right? So each seasonal produce, so we want to eat seasonal produce throughout the year, but we can, so that we can extend the shelf life. We also have a reliable source of food during any sort of emergency, and it's great to have that own personal sense of independence and self-reliance. So when we say home food preservation, what are we talking about? We are talking about how safe food preservation can stop or slow the natural spoilage process. So our foods are going to last a lot longer. We are preventing the growth of harmful bacteria, and we're going to preserve the nutritional value, taste, color, and texture. Now, some of the textures will change depending on the technique we're using, but we can talk a little bit more about that. So food preservation is not a new concept, but we do have a lot more new equipment available, and also recipes. We also have a lot more science available to us to kind of figure out what is safe, what is not, how long are these foods going to last, that sort of thing. So I do want to focus a bit on food safety. So these are our 4 basic food safety techniques, right? We want to make sure everything's clean, separate, cooked to proper temperatures, and chilled properly. So as with, I'm going to put in the chat here, we have just the food basics. Oh, I lost my chat, so give me 1 second. But so what we want to think about is what we can do to keep ourselves and our families safe while we're doing food preservation, but also any sort of food preparation. So want to make sure we're washing our hands with soap and water for 20 seconds. All of our utensils and surfaces are clean. And we do want to wash our fruits and vegetables, but we do not need to wash meat, poultry, or eggs. And then we want to make sure that we are separating our foods when we are preparing them, right? So we want to make sure we're using different utensils and having clean items for using cooked and ready to eat foods from raw foods. When we are cooking food, we want to make sure the temperature is proper. So really recommend using thermometers to test that. And then when we're chilling food, for food preservation, the chilling is a little bit different. So we'll talk about that. But in general, you want to make sure you are refrigerating foods within 2 hours of cooking. And then we want to talk about botulism, right? So the botulism is a major concern with food preservation, especially with canning. So it is caused by the bacteria Clostridium botulinum. And so what happens is the spores really exist in soil and marine sediment. So they're often found on the surface of foods. So that's why we want to make sure, we want to make sure we're washing our food very well, but also we want to make sure that we're handling everything properly. So the spores are not generally harmful to adults, but they can sprout into these vegetative cells in the right conditions. So those are low oxygen conditions and low acidity. So we want to make sure and be careful. These symptoms of botulism, they can occur anytime between 12 and 36 hours from eating something that's been infected. So those are nausea and vomiting, weakness, dizziness, and then you get into neurological symptoms like blurry vision, difficulty speaking and swallowing, lack of muscle coordination, which unfortunately can lead to you being prevented breathing. So how do we prevent this? We want to make sure that we're heating to the proper temperatures, and we want to inhibit the growth. So a lot of the things we'll look at is how we inhibit the growth by taking out the oxygen from during the food preservation method. So we'll go through 6 different methods today briefly. So the first is going to be freezing. It's one of the easiest and least time-consuming methods. I will say this is one of the methods I do personally the most. It's not going to sterilize our food, but it will slow the growth of microorganisms and the chemical changes that will affect the spoilage of the food. Then we have drying. It's one of the oldest methods and can be combined with other methods. We do have a lot of modern food dehydrators that allow you to preserve foods that take up very little space and they weigh a lot less because you're taking all that moisture out. So that's great for like camping or hiking, things like that. And they don't need to be refrigerated. Then we get to pickling. So that's a nice kind of fun way to add spice and flavor to your meals. And there's a lot of different flavors and varieties you can get into with the pickling. And then we kind of have our canning options. So there's water bath canning and there's pressure canning. So the idea with the canning is that you put the food in the jars or the cans and they're heated at a temperature that destroys any of these microorganisms, specifically the Clostridium botulinum. But there's different methods for different foods. So it's very careful. You must be very careful and really make sure you're using the right method for your food that you're canning. So water bath canning is used for high acid foods and pressure canning is used for low acid foods. And then we look at jams and jellies a little bit, and that is traditionally used to prolong the shelf life of seasonal fruits. We just made some raspberry jam in a demonstration video the other day, so we can have that all day, all year. All right, so a few things, no matter what method of food preservation you are using, there's a couple of things that we just want to highlight. So recipes. We want to make sure you're using scientifically tested recipes to ensure your and your family's safety. I have some resources for that that I'll share at the end. So your produce, you always want to start with fresh, firm fruits or vegetables free of spoilage, right? So has anybody's ever heard the term garbage in, garbage out? We want to start with high quality foods so that what we end up with is a really high quality product. Measuring, so we do want to weigh or measure amounts very carefully. This becomes a bit of a science experiment, making sure that we have all the right components. Amounts. So Pete mentioned that you don't want to grow too much things that your family's not going to eat, right? So it's the same thing with food preservation. You want to kind of preserve it in containers that is going to be the right size for your family to use all at once. We don't want to keep opening packages and closing, opening and closing, because that's going to prevent some spoilage. So using those right size containers from the get-go. And then storage. So we want to make sure we follow recommended methods and storage times for the highest quality products. So a little bit more about freezing. Like I said earlier, it reduces the temperatures of food so that water becomes ice, which is inhospitable environment for microbial activity. So for quality freezing, what we really want to do is freeze it really quickly. We want to freeze food quickly so that we don't get these larger ice crystals. There are some guidelines as to what freezes well and what doesn't freeze well. For vegetables, you're going to want to blanch them before freezing, and there's some charts on a website I'll share with you briefly. And then there's a few different methods you can use. So there's dry or tray packing method. So dry is you're going to take your product, you're going to put it in your container, you're going to put it in the freezer. Tray packing method is you're going to lay things on a tray, you're going to freeze it for about an hour and start checking it to make sure that things are frozen, and then you can put it in your container. The benefit of that is a little more work at the get-go, but the benefit is that when you're taking things out, they're not all stuck together. So it depends how you're going to use your product. We do have to allow for some headspace for expansion. When items freeze, they will expand slightly. And then there are a lot of different considerations for the containers you're using. So you want to make sure that you're not using a small necked container with a large bottom, because it's going to be hard to get that product out. So different things like that. If you are going to be freezing a lot of product, it's ideal to turn your freezer down to the lowest setting so that it will freeze quickly. And then you can kind of change it back to your typical setting once everything's frozen. When you are freezing product for the first time, you're going to want to put them so that there's air between the products so that the cold air can flow through, again, to freeze it as rapidly as possible. And then once those products are frozen, you're going to want to stack it as it is in this picture to keep things close together so that they stay cold together. At the bottom of this screen is just a little bit of a couple different methods to show you how to wrap some meat or seafood for freezing. All right, so then we're going to do drying. So the idea of drying is that it removes the moisture so that bacteria, yeast, and mold can't grow and spoil the food. It also slows down the action of the enzymes that can cause food to ripen. Again, foods will become smaller, lighter weight, great for hiking, great for camping, that sort of thing. There's a few different methods. If you're using an outdoor method, there's solar or sun drying, but you do have to pasteurize those items just to inhibit any sort of insect growth or anything that could have been affected by it. And then indoor methods, you're going to use a food dehydrator or an oven. If you have a convection oven, those are usually good because it has the fan process. If you don't, you have to leave your oven open a little bit just so that the airflow can happen, which just have to consider who's in your household and is that safe for you in your household. Some items will require pre-treatment. So For example, if you want to do some like apple chips, you may want to treat those with a vitamin C or ascorbic acid. That way they don't turn colors, that sort of thing. And if you are drying fruit, you're going to want to condition them. So what that means is you're going to take all your dried fruit, put it in one container for a certain amount of time, and that kind of helps even out all the dried and moisture activity in there. So then you can pack it into the smaller containers for you and your family. For storing, these are going to want to be held in a cool, dark place. They can be stored in a freezer to extend their shelf life. And then depending on what you're doing, you want to make sure you're following proper rehydration techniques. So let's say you're going to freeze some vegetables for a soup mix, just making sure you're following the right guidelines for reheating those at proper temperatures. Right, so for pickling, our ingredients are of the utmost importance. So for salt, you're going to want to use pickling or canning salt. A lot of your typical salts have a non-caking agent in them, and that'll make your brine really cloudy. For vinegar, we want to make sure that you're using at least 5% acidity. White or cider vinegar can be used. And then for sweeteners, the recipes typically call for granular white or brown sugar. Some will call for honey or corn syrup. Those can add undesirable flavors though, so you just want to make sure you're following what the recipe calls for. And then just something interesting I wanted to mention, that cucumbers, if you're, like say, you're getting them from your own garden, you want to make sure you're cutting about a 1/16 of an inch slice from the blossom end of fresh cucumbers, because there are some enzymes in that end that can cause the softening of those cucumbers as they pickle. So if you are pickling, canning is required to inhibit the spoilage from microorganisms and enzymes that may affect flavor, color, and texture. And most pickling recipes will call for water bath canning. The other thing you can do, just to keep in mind with pickling, is there's often curing times needed to develop those full flavors. So if you let them sit for 4 weeks after you can them, that helps get the flavor a little more developed. Oh, I should mention with the cider vinegar, you probably will not want to use that if you are pickling very light colored vegetables like a cucumber, a cauliflower, because that can kind of discolor the cauliflower. All right, so for canning, like I said, we have a few different methods, but these are just some basic, this is just some basic information that covers both methods. So the idea is we're going to remove oxygen, destroy enzymes, and prevent the growth of undesirable bacteria, yeast, and mold. So when you are heating these foods up in the canners, what's happening is the air is being driven out of the can or the jar. As it cools, a vacuum seal is formed. So there are some guidelines for proper techniques. That is, you want to most often use hot packing. You can learn a little bit more about that. Definitely need to add acid as the recipe calls for, except making sure you're using acceptable jars and self-sealing lids. There's a lot you have to check on your jars and on your lids to make sure there's no dents, there's no chips, there's no rust, anything like that. Being very adamant about measuring your headspace when you're canning. So making sure that you're following that recipe, because that's going to be how much air is going to have to be driven out of that product. And then you're going to want to process in a water bath or pressure canner. Again, the acidity level of that food is going to determine how it is canned. And then processing times are based on elevation. Throughout, I want to say most, if not all of New Jersey, we are follow the basic recipes for under 1,000 feet, but you can check on charts, and I have some more information on that. Also, with canned foods, you want to try and eat it within a year. So it wouldn't be canning enough food for the next 6 years. Think about what you're going to eat within the year. So just to reiterate, water bath canning, we really want to focus on that high acid foods with a pH of 4.6 or less. Food acid can be added to foods to reach the PS, but make sure, again, you're following those tested recipes. So sometimes they'll call for lemon juice. You got to make sure you're using commercially produced lemon juice, because it has a very specific pH level. If you are processing something in the water bath canner for less than 10 minutes, then it's also very important to sterilize your jars and lids before filling them with product to process them. So one of the biggest differences between pressure canning and water bath canning is with the water bath canner, you're going to put your jars in your canner covered by a few inches of water. With the pressure canning, you only add a couple inches of water to the bottom of the pressure canner. So that's one of the big major differences. So the other difference is with the pressure canning, we're talking about low acid foods with a pH over 4.6. So what happens here is the pressure canners get real hot and up to 240 degrees Fahrenheit, which actually will destroy that Clostridium botulinum. There are a couple different options for pressure canners. So there's dial or weighted gauge options. If you have a new pressure canner or have an old one and you want to get it tested, we do have a pressure gauge tester in the Passaic County office. It is on its way to get tested itself, so we're going to be ready for the season. So just give me a call if anybody has any questions on that. And then we have some information on jams and jellies. So there's a few different, obviously, ways you can preserve fruit. It's usually done with sugar and then thickened with some way. So there's a little bit of information about which different types of jams and jellies there are. So fruit jelly is a semi-solid mixture with fruit juice and sugar, firm enough to hold its shape. Jams are less firm than jelly, but they will hold their shape, and they're made from crushed or chopped fruit and sugar. Preserves are made from small whole fruits or uniform sized pieces in a slightly jellied syrup. Marmalades are soft fruit jellies with small pieces of fruit or citrus peel. And then fruit butters are fruit pulp cooked with sugar until it's thickened to a spreadable consistency. So the idea with these is that they all require a combination of the fruit, pectin, acid, and sugar. Now, some fruits will have enough pectin naturally that you don't need to add anything. Otherwise, you can get commercially prepared gelatins or pectins that you can add to the product, and that's all going to be in your recipes. Okay, so couple things. The National Center for Home Food Preservation is really the most trusted source for current research-based recommendations for most methods of home food preservation. So it's been established between Cooperative Extension and the USDA, and it's been around for a while. So it's out of the University of Georgia. I will put the link here in the chat as well. So this is where you're going to be able to find information on your canning, jams and jellies, pickling. It's very, very well organized. You can go, there's on the left-hand side of each category, you can find recipes by product, that sort of thing. So that's going to be where you're going to want to go for a lot of the information. And then we have some additional resources as well. So within the Family Community Health Sciences Department, we have some recorded food preservation videos and webinars. There is what's called the So Easy to Preserve. It's a book which is available for purchase. So that is through the University of Georgia as well, the National Center for Home Food Preservation. And then the USDA Complete Guide to Home Canning. So I will put these in the chat as well. And then we are very excited to be in development now of a digital badge program for home food preservation. So the idea with this is that community members will be able to sign up and go through this course with us and become kind of a community of learners. Our goal is to really engage folks in hands-on methods, even though it's an online program, to really kind of build this community of folks around the area that are able to kind of help each other out. Kind of let's talk about tips, let's talk about tricks, what's worked for you, what hasn't worked for you, that sort of thing. And then it's going to be available through the Rutgers University Continuing Education Program. It is not done yet. I will put in the chat if you want to learn more, you can fill out this form. And then, or you could just reach out to me. My email address and phone number is there on the bottom of the slide. And then if anyone is so inclined, we do have a brief survey just to talk about this presentation and collect some basic demographics. So we like to do these surveys to help understand who our audience is and what we can do better for future programming. And that is about all I have. So it went fast.
Well, thank you, Pete and Jen, so very much. Do we have any other questions? I'll check the chat. If there's any other questions, we could get those answered. And if not, I appreciate you all being here today. We will get all of those links put up as we post those videos. And just checking to see. Make sure we're not missing anybody. We have a question. Is there a favorite tomato variety you have, Pete?
Yeah, well, it was one that I helped develop, the Rutgers 250 tomato. So it was released for their 250th anniversary of Rutgers University. So that one's out there, but there's many others, Ramapo, the old school Rutgers. There's a lot of tomato varieties that I like.
That's great. Thank you. All right, if there's no other questions, I hope everyone has a great day, and be sure to continue to check out our other resiliency trainings on morriscountyedc.org. We have them coming up for the next 3 Thursdays at noon. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day.